Welcome. This video is going to look at what are known as electrochemical cells, and this is where we actually use redox reactions to do things for us in industry. And because redox reactions involve the transfer of electrons, there's a connection between redox reactions and electricity, and that's where we use it in industry. So the application of electricity with redox processes is an area of chemistry known as electrochemistry, which makes sense, chemistry and electricity together. And there are two main kinds of electrochemical cells. The one we're going to look at in this video is Voltaic cells, and they generate electricity. Get it? Like voltage or Voltaic cells. So they generate electricity from the redox reaction going on, or the chemical process. They also have the name of galvanized cells, or what you more commonly think of as a battery. The other kind of electrochemical cell sounds almost the same. It's called an electrolytic cell, and it uses electricity to drive a chemical reaction. And its name makes sense also because lytic or lysis means to break apart. You're using electricity to break apart a compound in an electrolytic cell. So what is a voltaic cell? Well, if you look at this picture here, this should look familiar to you because it's a lab we've done. It's a piece of zinc in copper sulfate, and the copper sulfate is blue and the zinc is silver. But you can see there's something depositing on that zinc metal, and that happens to be copper metal, and you can see the copper color, at least toward the bottom of the test tube. And the longer you let this go on, the more copper metal that will appear on there, and you'll see the blue color leaving the copper sulfate as it becomes more of a zinc nitrate solution. So when a process like this happens, electrons move through the solution from the zinc metal to the copper ions. And we've been looking at a lot of these redox equations and balancing them, talking about the two half reactions. But we could actually separate these two half reactions. We could put the zinc in one test tube, we could put the copper sulfate in another test tube, and then connect these two half cells with a wire, and the electrons would actually flow from the zinc over to the copper sulfate. And now instead of heat being generated, because this is a spontaneous exothermic reaction, instead of heat being the energy given off, it would be electricity, because electricity is just the movement of electrons. So a voltaic cell converts energy from spontaneous exothermic chemical reactions into electricity. It just makes that released energy something useful. So it consists of the two separated half cells, like I talked about on the previous slide, and one of these half cells is referred to as the anode, and the other is referred to as the cathode. Now, which one is which? Oxidation always occurs at the anode, and that's whether we're talking about a voltaic cell or an electrolytic cell. Oxidation, or the loss of electrons, is going to happen at the anode. So in this case, it's going to be the negative end because electrons are going to be given up by the metal, and they're going to stockpile until they can move across the wire over to where the ions are waiting for them. Reduction then happens at the cathode, the positive end. So the anode, as I said, becomes negatively charged as electrons are lost or deposited here as the oxidation of the metal occurs. And then the cathode becomes positively charged as electrons are removed from there as ions come in and gain the electrons or become reduced. So here's a picture down below of the simplest half cell is when you put a metal in a solution of its own ions. You have zinc metal in zinc sulfate and copper metal in copper sulfate. And you might be going, well, wait, I thought you said you could just put a zinc strip in a test tube, connect it with the wire to the copper sulfate. Well, it's slightly more complicated because we have to put zinc into zinc sulfate and copper into copper sulfate to create what we call some potential charge or some difference, because some zinc and copper atoms will form ions even when they're in a solution of zinc sulfate or copper sulfate in an ionic solution of themselves. And when they do that, that releases some electrons onto the surface of the zinc or the copper metal, making them ready to move. So at the same time, it creates some ions that want to gain electrons. So on the zinc end of things, we're getting some zinc electrons to release, some zinc atoms to release electrons that will travel over to the copper, and we're getting copper ions ready to receive those electrons. So we've got the half reactions stated here, and they're both reversible reactions. So we're stating them both as zinc ion going to zinc metal and copper ion going to copper metal. When we talk about voltaic cells, that's generally the direction the equation is written in, knowing that it's a reversible equation. So then when we talk about equilibrium, we're talking about the metal being the product or the right side, because generally this is done to obtain the metal. So again, here's a closer look at what's going on. The zinc metal forms some zinc ions by releasing electrons onto the zinc metal, and the zinc ion then becomes part of the solution and is freed from that metal. An equilibrium is reached between the metal and the solution, and this causes that charge separation that I mentioned, which is needed to get the electrons moving. So there's a charge separation between the positive ions and the negative, and you know that that will cause attraction between opposite charges and repulsion between like charges. So this accumulating charge on the zinc metal or between the zinc metal and the solution is what's called the electrode potential, or it's also referred to as potential difference. And the position of this equilibrium for the reaction is going to depend on the reactivity of the metal. The more reactive the metal, the more ions that are going to be released, and that will mean the equilibrium will lie further left. Now think about that a minute, because remember we're right in the equation, zinc 2 plus gains 2 electrons to form zinc metal. So if it's a more reactive metal, and zinc is more reactive than copper, we're going to have more of the zinc ion, and we're going to have the position lying further left. So it means it releases more ions, and there's less metal left behind. So the size of the electrode potential also depends on the reactivity of the metal. A more reactive metal is going to have the equilibrium further left and more electrode potential. And a less reactive metal will have the equilibrium further right and less electrode potential. So the same equilibrium is achieved in the copper half cell, but copper's less reactive, so we can assume and expect that the equilibrium is going to lie further right. There'll be fewer copper atoms losing electrons, and the electrode potential of copper is going to be a higher value because electrode potential is expressed as a negative number. So copper is going to have a higher number or less electrode potential. So voltaic cells, here just a little review. It's two half cells connected by a wire so the electrons can flow spontaneously from the more reactive metal to the less reactive metal. So knowing that zinc's more reactive and copper's less reactive, we'd expect the electrons to flow from zinc to copper, just like they did if we put zinc in the copper sulfate. The half cells can also be called electrodes, or more specifically the anode and the cathode. The anode is where oxidation occurs and will have a negative charge as electrons are deposited there or lost. And then the cathode is where reduction occurs and the electrons flow over to, but then they go right on to be picked up by the copper ions, which are going to gain those electrons or be reduced and deposit copper metal. The electrons will flow until there's an equal number on each electrode, or there's no longer potential difference. So to keep it going, to keep your batteries going more than just a short time, we use something called the salt bridge, which keeps the potential difference alive and well. So here's a picture of a voltaic cell. And some things you should notice is that you've got zinc and zinc sulfate, copper and copper sulfate. There's a wire connecting the two of them, and they've put a little light bulb in there so that you could tell there's electricity flowing. And then a couple other things you should realize is that the zinc is giving up electrons, and the electrons are flowing over to the copper side of things. So that means as zinc loses electrons, zinc ions are being produced and flowing out into the solution. At the same time, as electrons pile up on the copper metal, copper ions are attracted to that and pick up those electrons, and this copper ion then picks up the two electrons and becomes another copper atom. So copper ions are leaving the solution, zinc ions are joining the solution, electrons are leaving the zinc half cell, and electrons are moving over to the copper half cell. So again, with all this charge moving, very quickly there'd be no potential difference. So there is what's called this porous disk here, or this is more commonly known as the salt bridge. And what the salt bridge allows for is for these ions that aren't involved, anions and cations that aren't involved, to flow the opposite way. As electrons leave the zinc side, anions flow in to replace them. And as cations over here become copper atoms, we also will see cations flowing in the opposite direction. So both processes are occurring at the metals known as the electrodes. And as I said, we need to have a salt bridge to keep that potential difference going. So a little more about the salt bridge. Without a salt bridge, again, the charge would build up and there'd be no more potential difference and the electron flow would stop. So the salt bridge allows cations and anions to flow in the opposite direction. Anions flow to the anode because anions are negative and they're going over to replace the electrons that are being removed at the anode. And cations flow to the cathode because the positive ions are also flowing to the cathode, but they're being reduced there and removed from the solution. And one final thing on the salt bridge, the solution is usually chosen so that the ions that are flowing across the salt bridge don't interfere or compete with the reaction of the metals going on at the electrodes. So one of the last things to mention with voltaic cells is this idea of cell diagram convention, or how can I quickly show you what's going on in my voltaic cell without drawing that fancy picture that we saw a couple slides back. Well, the way that's done is with the cell diagram, and you always list the anode on the left and the cathode on the right, and then you put a double line to show where the salt bridge is, so right here. Double vertical line shows your salt bridge, and then the single vertical lines separate the metal and their ionic solution. And you notice the aqueous solution doesn't even specify what the anion was with it, because it really doesn't matter. Those are just spectators. And then you put the metals to the outside first and last with the single line between the metal and its aqueous solution. And then we write it left to right from anode to cathode, which makes sense because that's the direction the electrons flow, is from left to right. So that's just a quick way to summarize a voltaic cell. So really, any two half cells or metals can be connected to make a voltaic cell. The direction of the electron flow and the voltage you get will depend on the reactivity of the metals and the difference in their reactivity or the reducing strength. And you can use the metal activity series to predict both the direction of flow and the relative voltage. So for example, which generates a greater potential? Zinc and copper or zinc and silver? Well, if you look at the metal reactivity series, you will see that zinc is the more reactive metal in both cases, but copper is slightly more reactive than silver, so there's going to be a bigger difference between zinc and silver than zinc and copper. Which direction will the electrons flow in a magnesium-zinc voltaic cell? Well, now you have to look and see which one is the more reactive or stronger metal. And magnesium's more reactive, so it is going to flow from magnesium to zinc. Which direction would electrons flow in a silver-copper voltaic cell? Well, now you're not going to have a lot of potential difference because these two are both fairly low reactivity metals, but copper's the more reactive, so it would flow from copper to silver. So to finish up, remember, in a voltaic cell, electrons only flow one way through the wire, and that wire is called the external circuit. It's the external path for the electrons to be transferred. It goes from the anode to the cathode. Ions, on the other hand, flow both directions through the salt bridge. Anions flow from the cathode to the anode, and cations flow from the anode over to the cathode. Batteries are a common example or use of voltaic cells, and batteries are all set up. All you need is the external circuit, and they start working. Chemists are constantly looking to improve battery strength and life while reducing size by looking at a variety of metals, salt bridges, etc. But that also means disposal of used batteries becomes a problem when some of these metals are toxic in the environment, etc. So a lot of issues to consider as we develop more and more batteries for all the things we use them for.